Osborne. Osborne was a master propagandist. In 1956, he said, people, quote, won't accept the idea that they are in general second-rate. We must rely on other motivation. He called the new motivation, quote, a system of voluntary unconscious selection. So the way to persuade people to exercise this voluntary unconscious selection was to appeal to the idea of wanted and unwanted children. Osborne said, quote, let's base our proposals on the desirability of having children born in homes where they will get affectionate and responsible care. So in this way, the eugenics movement will move at last towards the high goal which Galton set for it. And Osborne stated the public relations problem very bluntly. He said, quote, eugenic goals are most likely to be attained under a name other than eugenics. So he greatly reformed the eugenics movement after World War II, and he's often credited with purging it of racism. But at the time of his supposed reform, he was president of the Pioneer Fund, holding that office from 1947 to 1956 secretly, and the Pioneer Fund is a notorious white supremacist organization. So obviously, you can imagine the likelihood of a secret racist purging racism from the eugenics movement. So this is, we could call it eugenics crypto-racism. In 1960, a member of the Eugenics Society founded a new periodical to advance these ideas. And this, the advisory council of the new journal included yet another member of the Darwin family, Charles Galton Darwin. And one idea advanced in the journal is the belief that anthropology, if it is understood honestly, shows that mankind is divided up into different species. This is one of the beliefs of Hitler. He believed that there were different species within the human race, right? You have the Aryans, which are the highest species. You have the Mediterraneans, then you have the blacks, and then you have the Jews, which are the lowest. So then we have this shift to genetics. Before the war, the American Eugenics Society laid out its research aims, including many investigations into different fields of science, such as sociology, psychology, anthropology, and biology. But they noted especially the important new fields, population study and genetics. After the war, research in genetics was led by a German eugenicist named Dr. Franz Kallmann. Kallmann taught psychiatry at Columbia University, and then in 1948 he founded the American Society of Human Genetics. He became a member of the American Eugenics Society, and this society developed hundreds of prenatal tests, not looking for cures. That it was promoted as if they were looking for cures, but they were looking for genetic defects. Over the next years, at least 124 people were members of both Kallmann's American Society of Human Genetics and American Eugenics Society. And the overwhelming evidence of a commitment to eugenics is especially troubling when you note that the members of the society promoted, developed, and now lead the multi-billion-dollar Human Genome Project. Another important field of study was population control. After World War II, the eugenics movement discovered, or you could say they invented, the population explosion and whipped up all this hysteria around the globe about it. So from 1952 onward, a major part of the eugenics movement was the population control movement. This was what Malthus predicted. Malthus predicted that the English continent could not support more than 20 million people. And today I think it's between 60 and 70 million people, and no problems. They're able to support all of them. So his predictions were greatly flawed. But the transformation from open eugenics to population planning is described well by Germaine Greer. Quote, "It now seems strange that men who had been conspicuous in the eugenics movement were able to move quite painlessly into the population establishment at the highest level, but the paymasters were the same: Ford, Mellon, DuPont, Standard Oil, Rockefeller, and Shell. That is, the population control movement was the same money, the same leaders, the same activities, with a new excuse." One of the organizations that promoted eugenics under the new population rubric was the Population Council, founded by John D. Rockefeller III. They spent about $174 million in 1952. No, that's just in its first 25 years. So clearly the people who think the eugenics movement died in Germany in World War II do not understand crypto-eugenics, genetics, and population control. So the extent of the population control movement is hard to imagine and hard to exaggerate. During the past few decades, there have been approximately 1.5 billion surgical abortions globally, probably more since this statistic was gathered. The United States Population Fund has sponsored 3 meetings bringing together the heads of state from most of the world to develop a global population strategy. This was in Bucharest in 1974, Mexico City in 1984, and Cairo in 1994. No other global problem has been the occasion for meetings comparable to these 3 with regards to the resources that were put into them. The World Bank, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and governmental agencies from nearly all the industrialized nations have contributed billions of dollars to campaigns designed to decrease population growth. Philip Hauser, also a member of the American Eugenics Society, explained the difference between family planning, which relies on the voluntary decisions of individuals or couples, and population control, which would include abortion, a commitment to zero population growth, coercion, euthanasia, and restrictions on international migration. And we all know the clear example of the eugenics movement in China with its one-child policy and all the horrors that go on in that country. But the United States government is responsible for much of the global population control. In 1976, a formal definition of national security interests described the major threats to the United States, one of which is population growth in Africa. The Agency for International Development was given the responsibility of defending America from this grave threat. This document was classified until 1992, when finally it was declassified, and it was distributed by the Information Project in Africa, and the covert depopulation policy that was kind of tucked into the American foreign policy and foreign aid program caused a great deal of resentment among Africans. And last week, I concluded by speaking about how the entire culture of death is built upon this fundamental principle of the eugenics project. Survival of the fittest, and this is Darwinism, right? Survival of the fittest. Kill or be killed. Might makes right. You can have it your way. This philosophy, when it's applied to biology, is Darwinism. When it's to sociology, it's Marxism. And to politics, it eventually becomes atheistic communism. And the communists, wherever they took power, whether it be in Asia or in the Soviet Union, they always started by teaching evolution. You exist because of random chance. You're just an advanced animal fighting, battling, survival. The weak must be eliminated in order to make room for those who are more fit. This, of course, is the exact inversion of the law of the gospel, which is the law of charity. Remember, Francis Galton, the father of the eugenics movement, said that charity upsets the mechanism of natural selection by encouraging the unfit to breed. Now, I mentioned this before, but notice how the eugenics movement was the most strong in Britain, in England, in Germany, and in the United States, the 3 major Protestant powerhouses. And the ideology, the philosophy behind this begins in the 17th century in England with the nominalist philosophers. And basically, all of this, we could say, in some ways, is a result of Protestantism. Protestantism has, at its core, and at least, as one of its motivating factors, it eventually becomes atheism, because if you refuse to obey the human authority that God has placed over us, then eventually you will refuse God. We know this from the great spiritual authors of our tradition as Catholics, that the acid test, this is what St. Teresa of Avila says, the acid test of humility and holiness is obedience to human authority. If you can't obey the authority of God, of the human authority that's been placed over you, you can't obey God. You can't love God. Think of an analogous situation. Think of a family. Think of parents with a large family with lots of kids. Imagine the kids tell their parents, "We don't want you, get out of here." They kick them out of the house, they force them out of the house, say, "Now we're free, we can do what we want." Initially they experience a sort of freedom, but eventually what happens is chaos. A chaos ensues. And this is the psychological state of spiritual orphanhood. To be an orphan means that there's no one to take care of you. And that means that you got to fight for survival. Now, as Catholics, we live by the law of charity. And this is, ultimate, as our Lord said to the Pharisees, I quoted this from the Gospel of John, you are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and has nothing to do with the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So I think that pretty much speaks for the entire eugenic movement, which operates by a whole system of lies, and their goal is death and destruction, murder. It's I think it doesn't take much to discern which spirit is behind this movement. Our Lord said in the Gospel of Matthew, he who finds his life will lose it, but he who loses his life for my sake will find it. Now, in the midst of the horrors that came about because of this ideology during World War II, God rose up some great saints in contrast to this horrible movement, one of which was a saint named Father Maximilian Kolbe, who we're all familiar with, who was condemned to the concentration camp in Auschwitz, and he took the place of a prisoner who was condemned to die, and he was put in a starvation bunker. And here's what a priest who was with Father Kolbe in the concentration camp said about Father Kolbe in the camp. He said, quote, the work was done on the run, with a foreman stationed at every 7 yards to beat any prisoner, especially priests, who slowed down. It was a real way of the cross. Father Maximilian was singled out to carry loads that were 2 to 3 times as heavy as what non-priests carried. If he paused for rest, he was beaten with sticks. When I came into contact with Father Kolbe, he still bore bruises and signs of beating, but he never complained. It was he who helped me penetrate the meaning of suffering. I expressed sorrow over his beating. He replied that he was glad to suffer, that everything came from the Lord. All one could see in him was peace, humility, total submission to God's will, and a great compassion for fellow prisoners. While the rest of us impatiently looked for liberation, he said he wanted whatever God and the Immaculata wanted. In the concentration camp, while we were crushed by inhuman sufferings and robbed of faith, he not only accepted everything as from God's hand, but thanked him and loved him all the more. In the starvation bunker where he was the last one to die, he encouraged everyone, all the men who were there, to die in the love of God, even those who were not Catholics or Christians. And because he didn't die, they had to finally inject him with carbolic acid, and the guards who were afraid to go down because of his serenity, there was a guard that converted because of it and said that he swore that he had light coming from his face. And finally, when they put him to death, he offered his arm to them, and his last words were to forgive his executioners. So this is the attitude of a son of a father who will take care of everything for us. We have to beware of the psychological state of our world, which is a psychological state of an orphan. You got to fight for survival. You have to be anxious and worried about everything. Now, it's important as Catholics that we support, as we are able, the pro-life movement. We know that abortion is one of the main hinges of the eugenics movement and the culture of death, so do what we can. And also those who are parents, to Pope Pius XII, encourage parents to be generous in opening your family to new children. It's one of the, very much a mentality of today's young couples is stinginess. Well, we're only going to have 2 children. Well, I think we're done. No, to open our families, open our families to new children. Be generous in welcoming life. We are a culture of life. We welcome life. We love children. To some of the you that doesn't apply. Some of you are past childbearing age, or maybe because of infertility. But you can encourage young families and do your best to help them. Material works of charity. Over Christmas, some very thoughtful people gave me a couple of gift cards to the grocery store. We know how expensive groceries are. Little gesture